where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
Picture this. London's grandest opera house, 1885, packed with society's elite desperately performing their rehearsed roles of respectability and charm. Every unmarried woman there had been groomed since childhood for one purpose: to attract a powerful husband through perfect behavior, pleasant agreement, and carefully calculated submission. Then there's Eve Aldridge, the woman everyone had written off as hopelessly unmarriageable, standing on a balcony, openly challenging the most powerful duke in England to his face, contradicting his views, refusing to lower her eyes or soften her opinions, despite the suffocating weight of social conventions screaming at her to behave. What happened next defies everything you've been taught about attraction. Instead of being offended or dismissing her as difficult, he became obsessed. One prolonged gaze across that crowded theater, loaded with intensity that bordered on inappropriate, and everyone in that building knew something forbidden and inevitable had just been set in motion. The secret hidden in that moment reveals a truth about desire that society desperately tries to suppress, because if everyone understood it, the entire game of playing small and acceptable and nice would collapse overnight. Here's what makes you uncomfortable. You've probably spent years, maybe your entire life, trying to be likable, agreeable, the person who doesn't rock the boat, or challenge anyone, or express opinions that might alienate potential partners. You've been told that's how attraction works: be pleasant enough, and eventually someone will choose you, like you're applying for a job where the least controversial candidate wins. And it's not working, is it? You're either alone wondering why nobody seems genuinely interested, or you're in a relationship where you're constantly performing a version of yourself that's exhausting to maintain. Or you keep attracting people who seem initially interested but lose that spark once they realize you're not actually the agreeable person you've been pretending to be. Meanwhile, you watch people who seem way more difficult, more opinionated, more unapologetically themselves, somehow attract intense devoted attention, and you can't figure out what they have that you don't. The answer is going to make you angry. They stopped trying to be chosen and started being themselves so completely that the right people had no choice but to pursue them. And you've been doing the exact opposite, making yourself smaller and more palatable and less threatening, which paradoxically makes you completely forgettable and fundamentally unattractive to anyone worth having. Eve's story shouldn't have been possible according to everything Victorian society believed about how women secure powerful men. She'd committed every social sin imaginable, educated herself beyond what was appropriate for ladies, developed actual opinions instead of just echoing whatever men said, refused to giggle at boring jokes or pretend interest in tedious conversations, and most dangerously, she wouldn't perform the elaborate theater of submission that was supposed to make her marriageable. Society had essentially exiled her to the category of lost causes, the women who'd end up bitter spinsters because they couldn't figure out how to be pleasant enough. But when the Duke of Thornbury returned to London after years abroad, mysterious and powerful, and able to choose literally any woman in England, his attention didn't land on the perfectly behaved beauties who'd been strategically positioned for his inspection. It landed on Eve, the difficult one, the opinionated one, the one who dared to challenge him publicly and meet his gaze without flinching. And that single moment of recognition between them contained more erotic charge than most people experience in years of appropriate courtship designed to lead nowhere interesting. What I'm about to reveal through their encounter will either liberate you completely or terrify you into doubling down on the safe, ineffective strategies you've been using. Because understanding these principles means you'll have to make a choice. You can keep being the pleasant, agreeable version of yourself that attracts nobody you actually want. Or you can risk being authentic and polarizing, attracting fewer people overall, but the right people intensely. There's no middle ground here, no way to hedge your bets, because the entire conspiracy of conventional dating advice is designed to keep you playing small, so you'll never discover that your supposed flaws, the very things you've been trying to hide or fix, are actually your most magnetic qualities when owned completely. Eve didn't know she was demonstrating timeless principles of attraction that would remain relevant 140 years later. She was just refusing to participate in her own erasure, and that refusal, combined with a duke who was brave enough to choose substance over safety, created something that made Victorian London gossip for years. By the time we're done examining exactly what happened between them, you'll understand why everything you think you know about seduction is probably backwards, and you'll have to decide whether you're courageous enough to actually apply it or whether you'll file it away as interesting theory, while continuing to wonder why your romantic life feels like an endless series of disappointing almosts and forgettable maybes that never quite become the intensity you secretly crave but are too afraid to reach for. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and instantly realize you're speaking a different language than everyone else? Not literally, but it's like there's this silent code everyone knows, except you. I'm talking about that suffocating sensation when you're square-shaped in a world that only celebrates circles. Growing up, I watched my cousins effortlessly glide through family gatherings while I stood in corners, wondering why I couldn't just play along with the game everyone else seemed born knowing. That's exactly what Eve Aldridge felt every single day in London's high society. She wasn't broken, she wasn't wrong, she was just different. And in 1885, different was basically a death sentence for a woman who needed a good marriage to survive. The secret nobody tells you? That discomfort you feel? It's not a weakness. It's actually your superpower trying to emerge. But society keeps pushing it back down like a beach ball underwater. Eve had committed what her world considered unforgivable crimes against proper ladyhood. First off, she'd been educated at some progressive school in Switzerland, where they apparently taught girls to think for themselves, which was basically considered witchcraft back then. She had opinions, real ones, not the polite, agreeable nonsense expected of women in drawing rooms. When some boring gentleman would drone on about politics or hunting, she wouldn't just nod and smile. She'd actually challenge his views with intelligent arguments. Her family was mortified. Can you imagine? A woman with thoughts. The scandal of it all. But here's what makes this story so powerful. Eve refused to play dumb just to make mediocre men comfortable. She'd rather be alone than pretend to be interested in conversations that made her want to claw her eyes out. Let me paint you a picture with an analogy that'll make this crystal clear. You know when someone puts a tropical fish, something vibrant and exotic, into a tank full of gray carp? That tropical fish isn't suddenly ugly or wrong, it's just swimming in the wrong aquarium. The carp look at it like, "What's wrong with you?" But really, the carp are boring and the tropical fish is magnificent. Eve was that tropical fish trapped in London's suffocating fish tank of sameness. Every ball, every tea party, every tedious social gathering was another day of slow suffocation. The other women would whisper about her peculiar behavior, how she was too forward or lacking feminine grace. Translation: she refused to disappear into the wallpaper like they had, and that made them deeply uncomfortable because it revealed their own silent imprisonment. Here's where most people, maybe even you, make the fatal mistake that leads to a lifetime of quiet desperation. When we don't fit in, we panic and try to camouflage ourselves. We change our hair, our clothes, the way we talk, even the way we laugh. desperately trying to blend into the background of whatever group we're trying to join. I did this at my first corporate job. Wore boring suits, laughed at terrible jokes, pretended to care about golf. But here's the brutal truth that nobody wants to admit. When you successfully camouflage yourself, you become invisible. And invisible people don't attract anything or anyone worth having. Eve could have done that, stuffed down her personality, married some forgettable viscount, and lived 50 years of polite misery. Many women did exactly that, became ghosts in their own lives. The hidden truth about London society, and frankly about most social circles even today, is that they don't actually want you to shine. They want you educated enough to make pleasant conversation, but not so educated you intimidate anyone. Pretty enough to be decorative, but not so stunning you outshine the hostess. Present at events, but never truly noticed or remembered. It's this weird game where everyone's supposed to exist, in this gray middle zone of perpetual adequacy. Eve was supposed to sit quietly in drawing rooms, practice her needlepoint, maybe play piano adequately, but not too well, and wait for some man to find her acceptable enough to marry. She was supposed to be a supporting character in her own life story. The lost art of being genuinely yourself had been replaced by this elaborate theater of pretending. Think about modern examples and you'll see this same dynamic playing out everywhere. It's that Instagram profile where every photo is perfectly curated, every caption carefully crafted to offend nobody and appeal to everyone. But when you scroll through it, you can't remember a single thing about that person. It's that resume that lists every skill imaginable, uses all the right buzzwords, but somehow conveys absolutely nothing about who you actually are or what makes you different from the 10,000 other applicants. It's that first date where you're so focused on being likable that you agree with everything they say, laugh at jokes that aren't funny, and pretend to love activities you actually hate. By the end, they might like you, but they don't even know you. That's not connection. That's just a really exhausting performance that nobody can maintain forever. But here's what makes Eve's story worth telling. What makes it resonate across 140 years to where you're sitting right now? She made a different choice, one that required more courage than charging into battle. She stopped trying to squeeze herself into a mold that was never designed for her shape. When her grandmother insisted she act more demure, Eve politely declined. When society matrons whispered that her education made her unmarriageable, she kept reading banned books anyway. When tedious men expected her to simper and flatter, she spoke her mind with devastating honesty. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake, it was something deeper. It was the refusal to participate in her own erasure. She looked at the life society offered her, that cage of respectability and suffocating boredom, and said, "No, thank you." Not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly. The real enigma everyone missed was that Eve wasn't actually the problem child they labeled her as. She was just the only one honest enough to admit that the emperor had no clothes, that the whole social game was an exhausting charade nobody actually enjoyed. While other women competed for scraps of male attention and approval, Eve was quietly conducting a different experiment. What if she just existed as herself and let the pieces fall where they may? Dangerous thinking for a woman but sometimes, when you stop chasing what everyone says you should want, something unexpected walks through the door. And that's exactly what was about to happen to Eve, though nobody, least of all her, could have predicted how it would unfold. There's this moment, and if you've experienced it, you know exactly what I'm talking about, when someone walks into a space and the entire energy shifts. Not because they announce themselves, not because they're loud or demanding attention, but because they carry something invisible yet undeniable that makes everyone instinctively turn their heads. I witnessed this at a conference last year in Barcelona. Hundreds of people networking, conversations buzzing, the typical chaos of ambitious professionals trying to connect. Then this woman walked in. I didn't even know who she was, and I swear the noise level dropped by half within seconds. She didn't do anything dramatic. She just existed with such certainty, such presence, that the room rearranged itself around her energy. That's not charm. That's not charisma in the conventional sense. That's power. And power, real power, doesn't need to announce itself because everyone can feel it the moment it enters. The night everything changed for Eve started ordinarily enough. Another tedious opera performance at London's grandest theatre. She was trapped in her family's box, surrounded by the usual cast of characters, pretending to care about music she couldn't even hear over the noise of social anxiety. Then the whispers started, spreading through the theatre like wildfire. That particular kind of urgent murmuring that signals something significant is happening. The Duke of Thornbury had arrived. Now, you need to understand something about Victorian society. Dukes were basically royalty without the crown. They owned vast estates, controlled political influence, and could make or break families with a single decision. But this wasn't just any duke. This was the duke everyone had gossiped about for years. The mysterious figure who'd vanished to Europe under clouds of scandal and tragedy. His return was the social event nobody expected. And suddenly, every calculating mother in that theater was mentally measuring their daughters against whatever standards they imagined he might have. Let me give you an analogy that captures exactly what happened when he took his seat in the ducal box. You know those rare earth magnets, the ones that are so powerful you can feel the pull from inches away? Some people are human versions of those magnets. They don't need to gesture wildly, don't need to speak loudly, don't need to perform for attention. The force field around them is so strong that you feel physically compelled to look, to notice, to orient yourself toward their presence. The Duke of Thornbury possessed that quality in abundance. He didn't sit down in his private box. He commanded the space, settling into his seat like a king surveying his domain. His gaze swept across the theater slowly, methodically, and wherever it landed, people felt it like a physical touch. Women blushed, men straightened their postures, and the entire social hierarchy seemed to reorganize itself in silent acknowledgement of his position at its apex. Three distinct elements combined to create his almost supernatural magnetism. And understanding these is crucial because they're principles you can actually apply in your own life. First, he had what I call silent confidence, that bone-deep certainty that doesn't need validation from external sources. He spoke rarely, but when words left his mouth, they carried weight, because everyone knew he didn't waste breath on meaningless pleasantries. Second, he maintained intentional mystery, that enigma that makes people desperate to know more. His years abroad, the whispered scandal, his first wife's tragic death, these were all vestiges of a story people knew fragments of but couldn't complete. Third, and this is the most powerful element, he projected complete indifference to others' approval. While every other person in that theater was performing for each other, calculating social moves, he seemed utterly unconcerned with anyone's opinion of him. That's intoxicating, because it's so rare. Most of us are desperately seeking approval, while pretending we don't care. The gossip network was working overtime that night. And if you listened carefully to the whispered conversations happening in every box and corridor, you'd hear the same threads repeated with slight variations. He spent years on the continent, something about a terrible scandal with his first wife. One matron would murmur behind her fan, "I heard he's finally ready to remarry. His estate needs an heir." Another would speculate with barely concealed calculation, Every important family in London has received personal visits from him in recent weeks. Someone else would add, and you could practically see the mathematical equations happening in mothers' eyes as they calculated their daughter's chances. The hidden truth everyone understood but nobody said aloud was that he had options, limitless options. He could choose literally any eligible woman in England, maybe all of Europe. Fortunes would be offered, families would beg for the connection, beautiful accomplished women would line up for the mere possibility of becoming his duchess. This is why what happened next matters so profoundly, why it reveals something essential about real attraction that contradicts everything society teaches us. See, there's a massive difference between power that's performed and power that simply exists. Fake power needs constant reinforcement. It needs to announce itself, prove itself, show credentials and achievements, and maintain an exhausting performance of dominance. Real power just is. It exists so completely that it doesn't need validation. Think about modern examples and you'll see this distinction everywhere. It's that person who joins a video meeting and even when their camera's off, somehow you're paying attention to when they might speak. It's that friend who barely talks in group settings, but when they finally say something, every conversation stops, because everyone knows it'll be worth hearing. The Duke embodied this authentic power. He'd been born into one of England's highest titles, but had also survived tragedy and scandal that would have destroyed weaker men, tempering his inherited status with earned resilience. And here's where the story gets interesting, where all the pieces were being arranged on the chessboard without anyone quite realizing the game that was about to unfold. You had this man, this figure of almost mythological status in their society, who could have any woman he wanted based purely on his title and wealth. He could have chosen someone from a powerful political family to strengthen alliances, or a great beauty to ornament his arm at social functions, or a sweet, docile girl who'd give him no trouble and plenty of heirs. The entire theater was full of calculated options, young women who'd been groomed their entire lives for exactly this opportunity. But power, real power, doesn't want what's easy or convenient or expected. Power seeks something that challenges it, surprises it, makes it feel something beyond the numbness of perpetual victory. And in that theater, surrounded by dozens of eligible perfumed possibilities, the Duke's attention was about to land somewhere nobody expected, on the one woman society had essentially written off as unmarriageable. The setup was absolutely perfect, if you think about it from a storytelling perspective, but this wasn't fiction. This was the messy, complicated reality of two people about to collide in ways neither could predict. Powerful man who can have anyone, plus woman, with no value according to social standards, equals a recipe for something completely unexpected. The silence in the theater had a quality of anticipation, everyone waiting to see where his attention would fall, which lucky family would receive the life-changing blessing of his interest. Codes of conduct dictated he should look toward the boxes containing the season's designated beauties, the daughters of influential families, the safe, appropriate choices. Instead, his gaze was about to do something that would set tongues wagging for months and reveal a truth about attraction that society desperately tries to hide. Genuine desire doesn't follow rules, doesn't care about appropriateness, and absolutely refuses to be controlled by should. Something was about to happen that would change everything. And the best part? Neither of them saw it coming. Real seduction, the kind that actually matters and creates lasting connection, doesn't happen over candlelit dinners in expensive restaurants or through carefully rehearsed pickup lines. It happens in those unguarded moments when the performance drops and you're forced to be yourself, because the circumstances strip away all the protective pretense. My most significant romantic conversation didn't happen at some fancy venue. It happened at 3 in the morning on a fire escape outside. A dive bar in Brooklyn, both of us smoking cigarettes we'd bummed off strangers, talking about childhood traumas and existential fears we'd never admitted to anyone. There was something about the raw honesty of that moment, the complete absence of social theater, that created more intimacy than months of proper dating could have achieved. When you remove all the performance, all the carefully constructed social masks, you finally get to see who someone actually is, and that's where real attraction either ignites or dies. Eve couldn't take another second of the suffocating atmosphere in her family's opera box. Her grandmother kept making pointed remarks about her posture. Distant cousins were whispering loud enough for her to hear about her diminishing marriage prospects, and the whole charade of pretending to enjoy terrible opera while being evaluated like livestock at market was making her skin crawl. She needed air, needed escape, needed just 5 minutes where she wasn't performing the role of acceptable society lady. So she did what any self-respecting person desperate for freedom would do. She slipped away when nobody was looking and found an empty balcony overlooking the theater gardens. The night air hit her face like liberation, cool and clean after the perfumed stuffiness inside. For just a moment, she could breathe, could exist without judgment, could be Eve instead of Miss Aldridge, who really should try harder to be agreeable. That's when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find him standing there, alone, without the buffer of social convention between them. Let me give you an analogy that perfectly captures what happened next. You know those scenes in old swashbuckling films where two master swordsmen face off, and the fight isn't brutal hacking. It's this elegant dance of thrust and parry, each move testing the other's skill? That's exactly what their conversation became. A verbal duel, where each statement was a calculated strike. Not to wound, but to test. To see if the other person could match their level. He didn't open with boring pleasantries about the weather or the opera. He went straight for something real. "You seem to find society as tedious as I do," he observed, and that single sentence was basically him saying, "I see you. I see that you're performing just like I am. Let's drop the act." Most women would have denied it, would have said something polite about how much they enjoyed the evening's entertainment. Eve didn't even hesitate before essentially agreeing with him, and that tiny moment of honesty was the first crack in both their carefully maintained facades. The dialogue that followed was the kind of exchange that changes lives, even though neither of them knew it at the time. "Your reputation precedes you," he said, which was aristocratic code for, "I've heard you're difficult and opinionated." Instead of being cowed or apologetic, Eve smiled and replied, "As does yours, Your Grace." She threw it right back at him, reminding him that he wasn't exactly society's golden boy himself. What with all those scandals everyone whispered about. First woman who didn't tremble or simper in his presence, first woman who treated him like an equal rather than a deity to be worshipped. You could practically feel the shift in energy, the way he recalibrated his entire approach, because she wasn't following the script. Then he asked about the opera, trying to draw her into conventional conversation, but she pivoted brilliantly. Those who believe a title gives them wisdom instead of merely land and privilege. She basically criticized the entire aristocratic system while standing 3 feet from one of England's most powerful dukes. The dangerous dance continued, with him pushing boundaries to see how far she'd go, testing whether her boldness was genuine or just a momentary flash of courage. "You speak quite freely for someone in your position," he observed, and that statement carried weight because he was essentially pointing out the power imbalance between them. A duke could destroy a woman's reputation with a single well-placed comment. Everyone knew that. Most women would have backed down, apologized, softened their stance. Eve leaned in. And what position is that, precisely? She refused to accept the diminishment he was implicitly suggesting, refused to acknowledge that she should be grateful for his attention or careful with her words. It was a breathtaking display of either courage or foolishness, possibly both. The secret nobody tells you about powerful men is that they're surrounded by yes people constantly, everyone agreeing with everything they say, and that gets boring incredibly fast. Challenge, intelligent, well-articulated challenge, is rare and therefore valuable. Then something shifted from verbal sparring to something physically charged, something that made the conversation dangerous in an entirely different way. He moved closer, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body in the cool night air. The scent of expensive whiskey and wood smoke and something uniquely him filled the small space between them. She found herself backed against the balcony railing, not threateningly, but definitively, trapped between cold stone behind her and his overwhelming presence in front. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional. A physical manifestation of the power dynamic they'd been dancing around verbally. Most women would have panicked or melted, would have lost their composure entirely. Eve held her ground, met his eyes directly, refused to show the nervousness that was absolutely racing through her bloodstream. That moment of held tension, neither advancing nor retreating, was more intimate than most people's first kisses. Here's why this interaction was so devastatingly effective, why it created the kind of attraction that doesn't fade after the novelty wears off. 99% of women in Eve's position would have defaulted to agreeableness, would have been nice and pleasant and utterly forgettable. They would have laughed at jokes that weren't funny, agreed with opinions they didn't share, performed the exhausting theater of being whatever they thought he wanted. Eve was real, authentically herself even when it was risky, even when conventional wisdom said she should be careful. And that realness completely disarmed him because it was so unexpected, so refreshing after years of calculated social interactions where everyone wanted something from him. Think about modern examples and you'll see the same dynamic. It's when you disagree with your crush in front of their friends and they respect you more for it. It's when you don't reply to texts immediately because you actually have a life outside your phone. It's when you maintain your own opinions and boundaries, even when it would be easier to just go along. The mistake women make constantly, and I see this everywhere from dating apps to corporate boardrooms, is assuming that being agreeable and accommodating and pleasant will make them more attractive. The brutal truth? Men worth having, men with actual substance and power and options, don't want submission, they want challenge. They want someone who makes them work a bit, who doesn't hand over their entire self in the first conversation, who maintains enough mystery and strength that the pursuit stays interesting. The Duke literally said this to Eve in the moment that changed everything. "You intrigue me, Miss Aldridge. I don't disapprove of your candor. On the contrary, I find it refreshing." He wasn't looking for another decorative doll who'd agree with everything. He'd already had that, and it had ended in tragedy. He was looking for someone real, someone who'd push back, someone who'd match him intellectually and temperamentally. And Eve, without even trying, without following any strategic dating advice, was exactly that person simply by refusing to be anything other than herself. Consequences be damned. And that authenticity was about to pull her into a conspiracy of attraction neither of them had planned for, but both were powerless to resist. There's this phenomenon that science has proven, but we all instinctively know. You can feel when someone's watching you. Not in a creepy surveillance way, but in that electric moment when eyes find you across a crowded space and suddenly everything else becomes background noise. I once dated someone I met through nothing but eye contact during an incredibly boring 3-hour lecture on corporate taxation. We never spoke during class, but for weeks we'd find each other in that auditorium and just hold eye contact for seconds that felt like minutes. By the time we actually talked during a break, we both knew something was already happening. The connection had been built entirely through looks that said everything words couldn't. That's the secret power of visual connection. It's honest in ways verbal communication can't be, because you can control what comes out of your mouth, but your eyes tell the truth whether you want them to or not. Eve returned to her family's box, with her heart hammering against her ribcage like it was trying to escape her chest entirely. Her hands were trembling slightly, that post-adrenaline shake that happens after intense moments, and she pressed them together in her lap, hoping nobody would notice. Her grandmother was too busy gossiping with nearby matrons to pay attention, which was a blessing because Eve couldn't have explained her flushed cheeks or the way her breathing had gone shallow. She tried desperately to focus on the opera performance resuming on stage, some tragic aria about lost love that suddenly felt uncomfortably relevant. But focusing was impossible because every nerve in her body was hyper-aware of his presence somewhere in that theater, like her entire being had developed sonar specifically tuned to detect him. The enigma of what had just happened on that balcony kept replaying in her mind. Every word, every movement, the heat of his body close to hers, the way he'd looked at her like she was a puzzle he desperately wanted to solve. Let me explain this with an analogy that'll make the physics of this moment crystal clear. You know that feeling when you sense someone staring at you, and you turn and they're across the room, but you absolutely knew they were looking. That's not mystical nonsense. That's your nervous system picking up subtle environmental cues, but it feels almost supernatural. A gaze has weight, has temperature, has pressure. It's like an invisible laser that crosses physical space and touches you without contact. Scientists have studied this, measuring pupil dilation and heart rate changes during sustained eye contact, proving what poets have known forever. Looking into someone's eyes creates physiological changes as real as physical touch. Your heart rate increases, your pupils dilate, stress hormones and bonding chemicals both flood your system simultaneously. It's literally physical, not just emotional or psychological. And that's why the moment Eve finally gathered the courage to look toward the ducal box felt so significant. Their eyes met across the crowded theater, across probably 50 feet of space and hundreds of oblivious people, and it was like an electrical circuit completing. The intensity of his gaze sent what she could only describe as a shiver down her spine, but it wasn't cold. It was heat. It was awareness. It was desire barely contained by the thin veneer of social propriety. He wasn't looking at her the way men usually looked at women in their society, with polite appreciation or calculating assessment of marriage potential. This was different. This was seeing, actual seeing, of the person beneath the dress and the social performance. It was the kind of look that strips away pretense without removing a single item of clothing, that makes you feel simultaneously vulnerable and powerful, because being truly seen is terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Eve couldn't breathe properly, couldn't think straight, couldn't remember why she was supposed to care about opera or reputation or any of the 1,000 social rules she'd been breaking all night. Here's something crucial to understand about the 3 distinct types of looking that happen between humans, because recognizing these will change how you navigate every interaction. First, there's the empty gaze. When someone's eyes pass over you, but they don't actually register you as a person. You're just part of the scenery, forgettable furniture in their visual field. Second, there's the social look, polite and appropriate, the kind of eye contact that happens in professional settings or casual conversations, enough to be respectful, but shallow enough that nobody gets uncomfortable. Third, and this is the rarest and most powerful, there's the gaze that marks you, that sees past your surface directly into whatever core makes you uniquely yourself. That third type is what passed between Eve and the Duke. And once you've experienced it, once someone has looked at you like that, every other form of attention feels like starvation rations compared to a feast. The paradox that makes distant looking more powerful than actual touch is that it's all promise and no fulfillment, all anticipation with no release. When someone touches you, the question is answered, the mystery is solved, at least partially. But when someone looks at you with clear desire from across a room, that's possibility suspended in air. That's want that hasn't been satisfied. That's tension that keeps building because it has nowhere to go. It maintains the charge, keeps the attraction alive and growing instead of being resolved. Think about modern situations where you've felt this. That person on the subway, whose eyes you kept meeting until one of you had to get off. The attractive stranger at a party who kept glancing your way all night, but you never actually spoke. That coworker whose gaze lingers just slightly, too long during meetings. The ones that stay in your memory aren't the ones where things happened immediately. They're the ones where the possibility hung in the air, unresolved, full of potential that may or may not ever be realized. There's actual science behind why this works so effectively, and understanding the biology makes it even more fascinating rather than less romantic. Sustained eye contact, especially between people experiencing mutual attraction, triggers the release of oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone, the same chemical that floods new mothers' systems to help them bond with their babies. Your pupils physically dilate when you look at something you desire, an involuntary response you cannot fake or control, which is why humans instinctively read pupil size when making trust and attraction assessments. Direct eye contact also increases heart rate and activates the same neural circuits involved in physical touch, which is why it can feel so intimate despite the physical distance. This isn't metaphorical. It's measurably happening in your body, your nervous system responding to visual connection as if it were physical contact. The mistake people make is breaking eye contact too quickly out of nervousness or social conditioning. But when you can hold that gaze, when you can sustain it, even when it feels intense, you communicate confidence, and that confidence is universally attractive. Eve sat through the rest of the opera without processing a single note or lyric, every fiber of her being consciously tracking his presence even when she wasn't looking directly at him. She could feel when his attention shifted toward her, could sense the weight of his gaze like sunshine on skin, warm and impossible to ignore. The ride home in the family carriage was silent on her part, her grandmother chattering about various social observations, while Eve stared out the window seeing nothing, replaying everything. She'd expected him to say something provocative, expected the words to be what stuck with her, but it wasn't the conversation that had burrowed into her consciousness. It was the way he'd looked at her, first on the balcony when they were close enough to touch but didn't, and then later across the theater when distance made touching impossible but desire made it feel inevitable. Something had shifted. Some silent acknowledgement had passed between them that couldn't be taken back or ignored. And Eve fell asleep that night with her heart still racing, her mind full of questions about what happens next when you've been seen, truly seen, by someone who was supposed to remain forever out of reach, but somehow had found a way to reach into her chest and grab hold of something she hadn't even known was available for the taking. There's this annoying thing that happens the moment your private life becomes public knowledge. Suddenly, everyone has opinions about decisions that have absolutely nothing to do with them. When I started dating my current partner, my entire extended family lost their minds. "He's not from our background," they said, as if background mattered more than character. "He works in what industry exactly?" Like his career choices were their business. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" As if they were the ones who'd be living my life, waking up next to him every morning, building a future together. It's exhausting, this phenomenon where people who won't experience any consequences of your choices feel entitled to veto them. But here's what makes it especially insidious. The pressure doesn't come from a place of genuine concern. It comes from their own fears and projections, and need to control what they can't understand. And if you're not careful, if you don't have a spine made of absolute steel, you'll let other people's anxiety dictate the trajectory of your entire existence. The morning after the opera, Eve's household exploded into chaos that would have been comedic if it weren't so suffocating. A footman had delivered an envelope bearing the Duke of Thornbury's personal seal, thick cream paper with his family crest embossed in blood-red wax, and her grandmother had nearly fainted from the shock and excitement. By noon, every neighbor within a 5-block radius somehow knew about it, because secrets, in Victorian London, lasted approximately 3 minutes before becoming public currency. Distant cousins Eve barely remembered suddenly appeared for tea, offering unsolicited advice with smiles that didn't quite hide their jealousy. Family friends materialized to share concerned observations about rushing into things, though what they really meant was how dare someone we considered beneath notice suddenly have access to something we want. The house became a circus of opinions, everyone talking over each other, nobody actually asking Eve what she wanted, and the pressure built like steam in a kettle with no release valve. Let me paint this with an analogy that captures exactly what happens when your personal life becomes a spectator sport. You know, when you're looking at clothes in a store window, just browsing, considering what might work for you? That's your private decision-making process. But now imagine a crowd gathers behind you, and everyone starts shouting their opinions. "That color's wrong for you. You can't afford that. My cousin bought something similar and hated it." Suddenly, what should be a simple personal choice becomes this overwhelming circus of external input, and you can't even hear your own thoughts anymore. That's exactly what happened to Eve. Her life had become a display window, and every person in London's social circle felt entitled to comment, critique, and attempt to control her decisions. The hidden conspiracy was that none of them actually cared about her happiness. They cared about what her choice would mean for their own social standing and opportunities. The cast of characters applying pressure each had their own agenda, and recognizing these archetypes is crucial because you'll encounter them in every significant life decision you make. First, her grandmother, absolutely vibrating with excitement about the possibility of having a duchess in the family, kept repeating, "This is your chance." A duchess. Do you understand what this means? As if Eve's value as a human being was entirely determined by what title she could acquire through marriage. Second, London society matrons who'd previously dismissed Eve as unmarriageable now watched with barely concealed envy, whispering that she doesn't deserve someone of his stature, revealing that their previous dismissal had been about keeping her in her place. Third, the genuinely jealous other young women and their scheming mothers who'd calculated their own chances with the Duke, and now saw Eve as an obstacle to be removed or discredited. And finally, buried under all that noise, there was Eve herself, trying desperately to hear her own voice ask, "But what do I actually want? And who is he really, beneath the title and the mystery. Then came the formal invitation that changed everything from speculation to reality. The Duke requested her presence at his country estate, Oakenhurst, for a weekend house party. In the coded language of their society, this wasn't just a casual social invitation. This was basically a declaration of serious courtship intentions. Unmarried women didn't visit unmarried men's estates unless marriage was being actively considered. The impropriety would have been scandalous otherwise. The invitation itself was a test, a public statement that he was evaluating her as a potential duchess, and everyone knew it. In modern terms, it's like when your significant other invites you to a family wedding or a major holiday gathering. That moment when casual dating becomes something with weight and expectation and future implications. The stakes had just increased exponentially, and with higher stakes came exponentially more pressure from everyone with an opinion about her life. The brutal difference between what everyone else wanted and what Eve needed to know couldn't have been more stark, and this is where most people lose themselves completely. Everyone around her was focused on the external markers of success, the title that would elevate the entire family's social standing, the vast wealth that would secure their financial future for generations, the prestige of being connected to one of England's most powerful families. Those were the vestiges of status everyone craved, the overt symbols society valued above all else. But Eve, perhaps because she'd never quite fit into society's mold anyway, was asking entirely different questions. Who was he beyond the title and the mystery? What would daily life actually look like with this person? Could she maintain her authentic self, or would she need to become someone else entirely? These were dangerous questions because they prioritized personal compatibility over social advantage, and that kind of thinking was practically revolutionary for a woman in her position. The element that made everything more complicated was the introduction of a deadline, because nothing creates pressure quite like artificial scarcity of time. The Duke had been explicit in his card. I wish to court you with the intention of marriage if we prove compatible. I am not a man who engages in games or extended courtship. However, I will not wait indefinitely for a decision. Translation: he was giving her a chance, but his patience had limits, and if she couldn't decide, he'd move on to one of the dozens of other women who'd marry him tomorrow without question. This added a ticking clock to an already tense situation, because now it wasn't just about whether she wanted him, it was about whether she could figure out who he really was before the window closed. The pressure of time is how people get pushed into decisions they're not ready for, how we end up choosing based on fear of missing out rather than genuine alignment with what we actually want. Think about modern equivalents, and you'll recognize this exact dynamic playing out constantly. It's when your partner wants to move in together, and you're not sure, but the lease is ending, and you need to decide now. It's when a job offer comes with a 72-hour deadline, and you haven't had time to properly evaluate if it's right for you. It's when someone says, "I love you," and clearly expects reciprocation immediately even, though you're still figuring out your feelings. The tension between honoring your own timeline and meeting external demands is one of the most difficult negotiations in human experience. Eve was trapped in that exact bind. Everyone around her was pushing her to say yes, immediately, to secure this opportunity before it vanished. But she couldn't shake the feeling that agreeing without truly knowing him would be trading one form of imprisonment for another, exchanging the cage of being unmarriageable for the potentially worse cage of being trapped in a marriage to a stranger wearing a ducal coronet. The lost opportunity to know someone before committing to forever seemed like madness, but society was screaming that she couldn't afford the luxury of caution, and somewhere in that noise, her own voice was trying desperately to be heard above the chaos of everyone else's expectations and agendas. True intimacy, the kind that actually binds people together, instead of just creating temporary closeness, begins the moment someone trusts you enough to show you their wounds. I'll never forget the night my partner broke down and told me about his struggle with depression, the years of medication and therapy he'd hidden from everyone, the mornings he couldn't get out of bed, the suicidal thoughts that had nearly won. He cried in front of me, really cried, not the controlled single tear of movie moments, but actual sobbing. And I had a choice in that moment. I could have judged him as weak, could have seen his vulnerability as a flaw, could have run from the reality that he was more complicated than the confident person he showed the world. Instead, that was the night I actually fell in love, because for the first time, I was seeing the real human being beneath the performance. Vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the courage to be seen completely. And when someone offers you that gift, you're holding something precious and terrifyingly fragile in your hands. Eve found herself alone in the Duke's library during her visit to Oakenhurst, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling books and the smell of old leather and wood smoke. She'd escaped the formal dinner party downstairs, needing space to think, to breathe, to figure out what she was actually doing in this massive estate with this enigmatic man everyone talked about, but nobody really knew. That's when Oliver appeared, the Duke's personal secretary, a man whose loyalty was legendary and whose discretion was absolute. Eve, never one to miss an opportunity, asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the opera. What really happened with the first wife? Oliver's face went carefully neutral, that particular expression loyal servant's master when asked to betray no secrets, but something in his eyes shifted. His grace was never cruel, Oliver said carefully, each word measured. Demanding, yes. Exacting in his standards. But never cruel. Whatever you've heard, remember that. It wasn't the full story, but it was a crack in the wall of silence, and through that crack, light was about to pour. Then the Duke himself entered, dismissed Oliver with a single look, and suddenly Eve was alone with him in a way that felt far more intimate than their balcony encounter. Let me give you an analogy that captures what happened next. Every powerful man wears armor, not the metal kind, but psychological protection built from years of people wanting things from him, of betrayals and disappointments, and the necessity of maintaining control. That armor becomes so permanent that most people forget there's a human being underneath, forget that the armor can even be removed. But when a man chooses to remove that armor in front of you, when he deliberately makes himself vulnerable in your presence, that's not weakness or manipulation, that's trust. That's him saying, I'm going to show you the parts of me I hide from everyone else, and I'm trusting you not to use them as weapons against me. It's one of the most significant gifts one human can offer another, and it's also one of the most terrifying. The story he told that night would have destroyed a lesser man, and understanding it is crucial because it reveals the kind of character hidden beneath his intimidating exterior. Charlotte, his first wife, had been beautiful and educated and from an excellent family, everything society said a duchess should be. But her family had committed an unforgivable deception. They'd hidden that Charlotte struggled with severe mental instability and a devastating gambling addiction. They'd concealed these facts because they were financially ruined and needed the marriage settlement desperately. So he'd married her, not knowing he was inheriting not just a wife, but a catastrophe. After the wedding, the truth emerged in horrifying layers. Secret debts that kept appearing, hundreds of thousands of pounds gambled. Away in underground gaming hells, episodes of depression so profound she couldn't leave her bed for weeks. He'd tried everything, brought specialists from Vienna, the best doctor's money could buy, remained faithful despite how difficult it became. Because when he made vows, he meant them. But here's where the tragedy deepened into something that still haunted him years later. He'd been in London dealing with another round of her hidden debts when it happened. Charlotte locked herself in the bathing room of their estate and ended her own life. And the servants found her hours later in a scene I won't describe, because some details are too painful to revisit. The guilt he carried wasn't logical. Therapists had told him it wasn't his fault. But guilt rarely responds to logic. He wasn't there. He'd been fixing yet another financial disaster she'd created, and some part of him believed that if he'd been present, maybe he could have prevented it, could have seen the signs, could have saved her. That's the kind of weight that changes a person fundamentally, that adds shadows behind the eyes that never fully disappear. The secret burden he carried was made exponentially worse by what her family did next. To avoid the scandal and social shame of suicide, which would have destroyed their reputation completely, Charlotte's family launched a calculated conspiracy of lies. They spread whispers that he had been cruel, that he'd neglected her, that he'd kept mistresses in London while she languished alone in the countryside, that his coldness and infidelity had driven her to despair. These lies spread through London society like poison, and he couldn't defend himself without revealing the truth about her mental illness and suicide, which would have destroyed her memory and hurt her innocent younger siblings. So he made an impossible choice. He let them paint him as a monster, took the false accusations in silence, and carried both his genuine grief and the unjust blame simultaneously. That's why he'd fled to Europe, not out of guilt for things he'd actually done, but because, living in a society that believed such horrible lies about him while he couldn't speak the truth, had become unbearable. He'd only returned now, years later, because time had softened the gossip slightly and because he couldn't hide forever from his responsibilities to his title and estate. This revelation completely reframed everything Eve thought she knew about him. He wasn't the cold, heartless aristocrat society painted him as. He was someone who'd been extraordinarily loyal to a woman who'd been ill, who'd tried to help her despite enormous difficulties, who'd honored his marriage vows even when it cost him everything. He'd been faithful when he could have easily kept mistresses, and nobody would have thought less of him for it. That's just what powerful men did in their world. He'd sacrificed his reputation to protect a dead woman's memory and her family's standing. And now he was risking his heart again, choosing to be vulnerable with Eve, trusting her with the truth that could destroy him if she repeated it to the wrong people. The enigma of his distant behavior suddenly made perfect sense. He'd learned that letting people close could result in devastating pain, so he'd built walls. But here he was, offering to lower those walls for her, and that offer came with implicit acknowledgement that she had power to hurt him. Understanding the three types of male vulnerability is essential because mistaking one for another leads to disaster. First, there's false vulnerability, which is actually manipulation disguised as openness. I'm so broken. Only you can fix me. Please save me. That's not intimacy. That's emotional hostage-taking. Second, there's uncontrolled vulnerability, emotional explosions where a man dumps trauma without any self-awareness or regulation, which is overwhelming and often scary rather than connecting. Third, and this is what the Duke offered Eve, there's authentic controlled vulnerability, acknowledging pain and struggle while maintaining dignity, sharing wounds without demanding she heal them, being honest about past damage while taking responsibility for present behavior. That third type creates real intimacy because it says, I'm human, I've suffered, I'm still standing, and I'm choosing to let you see all of it. Think about modern examples. It's when your partner tells you about his abusive childhood, but has clearly done the therapy work to process it. When he admits fear of failure, but doesn't let that fear paralyze him. When he cries and doesn't apologize for having emotions, while also not making his emotions your responsibility to manage. The shift in Eve's perception was seismic, like tectonic plates rearranging beneath her feet. She'd come to Oakenhurst thinking he was evaluating her, judging whether she was worthy of being his duchess, holding all the power in their potential dynamic. But his revelation revealed a different truth. He was just as vulnerable as she was, maybe more so because he'd already been destroyed once and was consciously choosing to risk it happening again. He wasn't shopping for a wife the way one shops for furniture. He was looking for someone he could trust, with the actual person beneath the title and wealth and power. And he'd chosen to trust her. This woman society had written off as unmarriageable. This opinionated outsider who challenged him instead of flattering him. The lost pieces of the puzzle suddenly assembled into a coherent picture. And what emerged was far more complex and human than the mysterious Duke everyone gossiped about. He was offering her not just a position but a partnership, not just a title but a chance at genuine connection. And that offer terrified her precisely because it was real in ways that safe conventional courtship never would be. And reality always carries the weight of authentic consequence that fantasy conveniently avoids. There are moments in life where you stand at a crossroads and you know, absolutely know, that whichever path you choose will determine the entire trajectory of your existence from that point forward. I had one of those moments 3 years ago. I had a stable corporate job, 6-figure salary, benefits, the whole package everyone told me to be grateful for. But I was dying inside, literally felt parts of my soul withering every time I sat in another pointless meeting about quarterly projections, so I quit. Just walked away from the security everyone craves to pursue this uncertain life of content creation and writing. My family thought I'd lost my mind. You're throwing away everything you worked for, they said, as if working towards something that kills you slowly is somehow noble. But I needed to be myself, more than I needed to be safe. And that's a calculation most people never have the courage to make, which is why so many people reach 50 and realize they've lived someone else's definition of success while their own dreams died of neglect. Eve sat in the drawing room of Oakenhurst staring at 2 impossible choices, and both felt like jumping off cliffs in different directions. Option 1, the safe path. Politely decline the Duke's courtship, return to London, eventually accept a proposal from some boring but appropriate viscount or baron, live a conventional life of tedious respectability. She'd have security, social acceptance, a predictable future where nothing surprising or devastating would happen because nothing passionate or real would happen either. It was the path of least resistance, the choice that would make everyone comfortable, the life where she'd spend decades attending tea parties and charity events, and slowly forgetting there was ever a version of herself that wanted more. Option 2, the terrifying path. Accept the Duke, dive into the unknown with this complicated, damaged man who'd trusted her with his secrets, risk everything on the possibility that what they'd started building might become something extraordinary. That path had no guarantees, could lead to happiness or heartbreak, or probably both in unpredictable measures. Let me give you an analogy that perfectly captures the essence of her dilemma. Imagine you're hiking and come to a fork in the trail. Path 1 is flat, paved, well-marked, and you can see exactly where it leads because it's straight and boring, and thousands of people have walked it before you. Path 2 climbs into mountains, has steep sections and dangerous curves, might have spectacular views, or might have cliffs that could kill you. end. You absolutely cannot see where it ends because it curves into mystery. Most people choose path 1 every single time, then spend the rest of their lives wondering what they missed by never taking the risk. Eve was staring at that exact choice, and every logical, practical voice in her head was screaming to choose safety. But there was another voice, quieter but more insistent, asking whether existing safely was really living at all, or just a slow, comfortable death spread across decades. The weight against choosing him was substantial, and she catalogued every concern with the methodical precision of someone trying to talk herself out of something her heart desperately wanted. The class difference was enormous. He was a duke, and she was barely gentry. That gap would follow them forever with society, constantly questioning whether she deserved her position. His traumatic past wasn't just history. It was unresolved grief and guilt that could resurface in destructive ways. She'd be partnering with someone carrying serious emotional baggage. The social pressure would be relentless. Every move she made would be scrutinized and judged and compared to some impossible standard of ducal perfection. There was genuine risk of repeating Charlotte's tragedy. What if the intensity of life, with him, became overwhelming? What if she couldn't handle the isolation and pressure that had contributed to destroying his first wife? These weren't paranoid fantasies. They were legitimate concerns that any rational person would consider carefully before making such a consequential decision. But then there was the other side of the ledger, the arguments her heart kept making against her head's practical objections. The connection between them was undeniably real. Not the polite compatibility of suitable matches, but something electric and challenging and alive. He saw her as she actually was, didn't need her to perform or pretend or diminish herself to make him comfortable. And that kind of acceptance was so rare, she might never find it again. She wouldn't have to spend her life being agreeable and appropriate, and slowly suffocating under the weight of others' expectations. There was the possibility, not guaranteed but genuinely possible, of real love, the kind that poets write about, and most people never experience because they're too afraid to risk the pain that comes packaged with that kind of intensity. And perhaps most compelling, this felt like actually living instead of just existing, like choosing the full spectrum of human experience rather than the muted beige safety of conventional choices. The hidden truth was that safe choices can fail too. Marrying that boring viscount could still lead to misery and regret. At least with the Duke, the potential reward matched the magnitude of risk. Everyone carries 3 fundamental fears that paralyze decision-making, and recognizing them is essential to pushing past them. First, the fear of making the wrong choice. What if I regret this? What if I look back and realize I ruined my life? But here's the secret. Nobody tells you. You'll have regrets either way. The only question is which regrets you can live with more easily. Second, fear of judgment. What will people think? What will they say about me? As if living your life according to other people's opinions is somehow safer than living according to your own values. Third, fear of inadequacy. What if I'm not enough? What if I can't handle this? That fear is often just your psyche's way of keeping you small and safe, protecting you from growth that requires temporary discomfort. Eve felt all 3 fears screaming at her simultaneously, a chorus of anxiety trying to keep her in the known territory of conventional life. The brutal truth she was slowly accepting was that every significant choice involves risk, and the absence of risk is actually the presence of stagnation. That safe marriage everyone was pushing her toward could fail spectacularly. The boring viscount could turn out to be cruel or unfaithful, or simply soul-crushingly tedious for 50 years. Security isn't actually secure, it's just familiar. And familiar feels safe even when it's slowly killing you. At least with the Duke, if things fell apart, she'd know she tried for something real, reached for something extraordinary even if she couldn't hold it. There's a dignity in failing at something meaningful that doesn't exist in succeeding at something you never actually wanted. Think about modern equivalents, and you'll see this exact dilemma everywhere. It's leaving a stable job to start a business that might fail. It's dating someone your family disapproves of because the connection is real. It's moving to a new city for love or opportunity or growth. It's choosing what makes you come alive versus what keeps everyone else comfortable with your mediocrity. What nobody tells you about comfort zones is that they're actually death zones, just slower and more socially acceptable than dramatic catastrophes. You stay in that safe relationship that's fine but not fulfilling, that job that pays well but crushes your spirit, that city where you're miserable but established, that version of yourself that everyone approves of, but you don't recognize in the mirror. Years pass, decades pass, and one morning you wake up 50 or 60 years old and realize you spent your entire life being what other people needed you to be, living a story someone else wrote for you. The grief of that realization, the lost opportunity to have been yourself, fully and without apology, is worse than any failure that comes from actually trying. Eve could feel that future hovering like a ghost, could see herself at 45 sitting in some country estate, married to a man whose name she could barely remember, having conversations that meant nothing about nothing, wondering what would have happened if she'd been brave enough to choose authenticity over convenience, passion over propriety, the terrifying unknown over the suffocating known. The decision was crystallizing, not through logic or careful weighing of pros and cons, but through something deeper and more essential. She'd spent her entire life not fitting into the boxes society created, refusing to perform the role of proper lady, maintaining her authentic self even when it cost her social capital. Why would she abandon that authenticity now by choosing a safe conventional marriage just because everyone expected it? The Duke had offered her something almost unprecedented, the chance to be fully herself within a powerful partnership, to maintain her opinions and strength and complexity while building something real with someone who matched her intensity. It was terrifying precisely because it mattered, because the stakes were high enough that failure would hurt tremendously. But the alternative, choosing safety and spending the rest of her life wondering what if, felt like a betrayal of everything she'd fought to preserve in herself against years of pressure to conform. And that betrayal seemed like a worse fate than any risk she'd be taking by saying yes to the enigmatic Duke, who'd removed his armor and shown her his wounds and trusted her to see him as human rather than myth, hoping she was brave enough to be equally human in return. After years of studying relationships, reading hundreds of books on human connection, interviewing couples who've stayed together for decades, and analyzing my own romantic successes and spectacular failures, I've arrived at a conclusion that would have saved me enormous heartache if I'd understood it earlier. The fundamental dynamics of attraction haven't changed in centuries. What worked in 1885 works in 2025 because human psychology doesn't evolve at the same pace as technology. We're still running the same emotional software our ancestors had, still responding to the same triggers, still making the same mistakes, and occasionally stumbling into the same transcendent connections. Eve and the Duke's story isn't just historical romance, it's a blueprint for understanding what creates real, lasting attraction versus the shallow, temporary sparks that burn bright and die fast. The secret hidden in their encounter contains 7 specific lessons that are as applicable to your dating app match next week as they were to Victorian ballrooms. And understanding these principles will fundamentally change how you approach every romantic interaction for the rest of your life. Lesson 1 is perhaps the most important and most commonly misunderstood. Authenticity wins over perfection every single time. Eve didn't try to be the perfect, proper lady everyone expected. She didn't memorize the right things to say, or perform elaborate social graces, or pretend to be interested in things she found boring. She was herself, opinionated and challenging and real, even when conventional wisdom said she should be agreeable and accommodating. And that authenticity made her irresistible to someone who'd spent years surrounded by calculated performances and strategic social climbing. Think about how this applies today. Stop curating your social media to show only highlight reels that make you look perfect. Start showing who you actually are with your weird interests and unpopular opinions and authentic personality. Stop crafting text messages like you're writing diplomatic cables. Start communicating like a real human with thoughts and feelings and occasional typos. Perfect is boring and forgettable. Real is magnetic and memorable. And the people worth attracting are looking for the second thing, not the first. Lesson 2. Challenges. Everything Disney movies taught us. Intelligent challenge attracts far more powerfully than pleasant submission. Eve disagreed with the Duke, debated him, refused to simply nod along with his statements just because he was powerful and titled and could have crushed her socially with a word. She treated him like an equal intellectually, even though they weren't equals in any other way, and that shocked him because, powerful, men are surrounded by yes people constantly. Everyone agrees with them, flatters them, tells them what they want to hear, and it becomes suffocatingly boring. When someone finally pushes back with intelligence and wit, when someone treats them like a human who can handle disagreement, rather than a deity who must be worshipped, it's like oxygen after drowning. Apply this today. Stop being a conversational doormat who agrees with everything your crush says. Have your own opinions and express them with confidence. Don't be contrarian for the sake of it, but don't abandon your authentic perspective just to be liked either. Men and women who are actually worth your time want partners who challenge them to think better and be better, not emotional servants who applaud their every thought. The third lesson reveals why playing hard to get actually works when done authentically. Less is genuinely more, and mystery beats availability. Eve didn't reveal everything about herself immediately, didn't chase after the Duke or make herself constantly available, maintained enough distance that he had to work to understand her. This isn't manipulative game-playing. It's maintaining your own life and identity rather than abandoning everything the moment romantic possibility appears. The psychology is simple. Humans value what requires effort to obtain and dismiss what comes too easily. In today's world of instant communication, this means stop responding to texts within 30 seconds like you're sitting by your phone, waiting for their attention. Have actual things happening in your life that matter more than romantic pursuit. Don't document your entire day on social media stories, giving them access to every moment. Maintain some mystery, some private internal life they have to earn access to over time. The vestiges of old courtship wisdom remain relevant. What's easily won is easily discarded. What requires pursuit is valued. Lesson 4 is something most people completely underestimate. Eye contact communicates more powerfully than words ever could. The moment that changed everything between Eve and the Duke wasn't a conversation. It was that sustained gaze across the theater, that held look that communicated desire and recognition and possibility without a single syllable being spoken. Visual connection triggers actual physiological responses in your body, releases bonding hormones, increases heart rate, creates intimacy that words often can't match. Practice this in real life. When talking to someone you're interested in, sustain eye contact for 3 to 5 seconds instead of nervously looking away after one. When you catch someone looking at you, hold their gaze instead of immediately breaking it. This single skill, learning to be comfortable with sustained eye contact, will transform how people respond to you because it communicates confidence and interest and presence more effectively than any carefully crafted compliment. The fifth lesson is crucial for men specifically, but applies universally. Vulnerability, when properly calibrated, creates magnetic intimacy. The Duke didn't collapse into emotional chaos or dump his trauma carelessly, but he did deliberately remove his armor and show Eve the wounded human beneath the powerful facade. He shared his pain with dignity, admitted his fears while maintaining strength, let her see his complexity without making his emotional state her responsibility to fix. This created deep connection because it was real, because being truly seen is what everyone craves, even though it terrifies us. Men, understand this. Showing emotion isn't weakness, it's courage. But there's a difference between authentic vulnerability and emotional manipulation or uncontrolled dumping. Share your struggles while taking responsibility for processing them. Admit your fears while continuing to move forward despite them. Cry when you need to without apologizing for having feelings. Women respond to this not because they want to fix you, but because they want to know the real human they're potentially building a life with, not just the impressive persona you perform for the world. Lesson 6 might be the most practically applicable. Timing matters as much as the message itself. Eve didn't challenge the Duke publicly in front of his peers, where it would have been humiliating. She waited until they were alone, where honest conversation could happen. He didn't reveal his traumatic past during their first meeting, when it would have been overwhelming. He waited until trust had been established. Every conversation has an optimal moment, and forcing deep discussions too early kills connection as surely as avoiding them too long creates distance. Stop trying to have profound conversations through text messages where nuance dies and misunderstanding thrives. Stop bringing up relationship-defining topics in inappropriate settings where neither person can properly engage. Wait for the right moment. Create space for important conversations. Recognize when someone's ready to go deeper versus when pushing will just create defensiveness. The conspiracy against good communication is often just poor timing masquerading as incompatibility. The seventh and final lesson contains the entire mystery of lasting attraction. Choose and be chosen for your authentic self, not your performed version. The Duke didn't want a wife, some generic appropriate woman who'd fulfill the role's requirements. He wanted Eve specifically with all her challenging, opinionated complexity. He wasn't looking to mold someone into his ideal. He was looking for someone whose actual personality matched what he needed, even when that personality was difficult or unconventional. This is the ultimate test. If you need to pretend to be someone else to attract or keep someone, you're not actually loved. You're tolerated, and that tolerance will eventually become resentment. Find someone who loves your real personality, your actual interests, your genuine values, even the parts you consider flaws, and offer the same in return. Choose people for who they authentically are, rather than who you imagine you could change them into. The analogy of the mirror works perfectly here. A real relationship should reflect your best self back to you, should make you more yourself rather than less, should expand who you are rather than diminish it to fit someone else's requirements or expectations or limitations. And when you find that rare mirror that shows you truly seen and accepted and celebrated for exactly who you are, you've found something worth fighting for, even when fighting is terrifying, and the outcome is uncertain and society thinks you're making a mistake because they're measuring with completely irrelevant metrics. that prioritize safety over substance and convention over connection. So here's the real question, the one that matters more than anything else we've discussed. What are you actually going to do with this knowledge? Because understanding these principles intellectually, while continuing to live the same safe, comfortable patterns, changes absolutely nothing. You've just spent time learning that authenticity beats perfection, that challenge attracts more than submission, that vulnerability creates intimacy, that mystery matters, that timing is everything, and that being chosen for who you actually are is the only thing worth pursuing. But knowing isn't the same as doing, and doing requires courage that most people simply don't have, because it means risking rejection, judgment, and the comfortable mediocrity you've built your life around. Eve stood on that balcony and chose to be herself, even when everyone said it would destroy her chances. And that choice changed her entire trajectory. The Duke removed his armor and showed his wounds, even though vulnerability had nearly destroyed him before. And that risk created connection that safeguarded interactions never could. What's your equivalent moment? Where in your life right now are you playing small, being agreeable, hiding your authentic self because you're terrified of what might happen if people saw who you really are? Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Are you actually applying any of this, or are you just consuming it like entertainment? When you're texting that person you're interested in, are you being real, or are you carefully crafting responses designed to be maximally inoffensive? When you're on a date, are you expressing genuine opinions, or are you performing the role of pleasant company? When someone asks what you think, do you say, "What you actually think," or what you imagine they want to hear? Because here's the brutal truth. Every moment you choose performance over authenticity, you're betraying the same principles that could transform your entire romantic life. You're choosing the comfort of not being rejected for who you are by accepting the slow death of never being truly known or wanted for who you actually are. That's not safety. That's cowardice dressed up as prudence, and it leads exactly nowhere worth going. The secret every successful relationship shares is that both people got tired of pretending and decided being alone was preferable to being misunderstood, and that decision paradoxically made them magnetic to the right person. Think about the last relationship or dating situation that disappointed you. Really think about it. Were you actually yourself, or were you performing a version you thought would be more acceptable? Did you challenge them intellectually, maintain your own life and mystery, show appropriate vulnerability while maintaining dignity? Or did you become available constantly, agree with everything, abandon your boundaries and authentic personality, in hopes that being easy and pleasant would make them choose you? Because if it's the second one, you didn't lose someone who was right for you. You lost someone who was never going to appreciate your real self anyway, because you never showed it to them. That's not tragedy. That's information. The question is whether you're going to learn from it or repeat the same pattern with the next person, then the next, then the next, until you're 50 years old wondering why you've never experienced the kind of connection you see other people having, never understanding that those people aren't luckier or more attractive or more successful. They're just braver about being themselves and accepting that fewer people will want them, but the ones who do will want them intensely. Here's what I want you to do right now. Not tomorrow or next week when you feel ready, but right now, while this is still fresh and you haven't rationalized your way back into comfortable patterns. Identify one specific area where you're currently performing instead of being authentic. Maybe it's that relationship where you pretend to like activities you hate. Maybe it's your dating profile that shows a curated highlight reel instead of your actual personality. Maybe it's how you communicate through text, like you're writing diplomatic cables instead of talking like a human being. Pick one thing, just one, and commit to changing it today. Stop agreeing with everything your partner says and express one genuine disagreement with respect and intelligence. Rewrite your dating profile to include something real and potentially polarizing about who you actually are. Send a text message. That sounds like how you actually talk instead of like you're composing literature. Start small if you need to, but start, because the gap between knowing and doing is where most people's potential dies quietly. And I refuse to let that be your story if you're actually paying attention to what I'm saying here. And while you're at it, ask yourself the hardest question. Who in your life right now is accepting a performed version of you instead of your authentic self? Your romantic partner? Your friends? Your family? Because here's something Eve and the Duke understood that most people never figure out. You cannot build real connection on false foundation. Eventually, the performance collapses, and you're left with people who loved a character you were playing, not the person you actually are. That's why so many relationships that seem perfect from the outside feel empty from the inside. That's why people who appear to have everything feel profoundly alone. That's why chasing approval leaves you exhausted and unsatisfied. You're maintaining relationships with people who don't actually know you, and being unknown is the loneliest feeling in human experience. What would happen if you stopped performing? Would some people leave? Probably. Would that be the worst thing? Absolutely not. The people who leave when you stop pretending are doing you a favor, making room for people who will actually want the real you. And those people are worth infinitely more than 1,000 superficial connections built on who you're pretending to be. So here's my final challenge, and it's not optional if you actually want your life to change. Are you going to be brave? Not reckless or careless or stupidly risky, but authentically courageously yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, even when people judge you, even when it means standing alone sometimes because you refuse to shrink yourself to fit spaces that were never designed for your shape. Because that's what this entire story has been. About choosing authenticity over acceptance, substance over safety, the terrifying freedom of being yourself over the comfortable prison of being what everyone expects. Eve made that choice standing on a balcony defying a duke while society watched in horror. The Duke made that choice, revealing his broken pieces to a woman who could have used them against him. They both risked everything for the possibility of something real, and that risk is what created the connection that made Victorian London talk for years. Your risks probably won't be as dramatic. You're not defying dukes at opera houses, but the principle is identical. Stop performing, start being, and watch how the right people suddenly see you in ways nobody ever has before, while the wrong people conveniently remove themselves from your life without you having to do the hard work of cutting them loose. If this resonated with you, if something in these stories and principles made you feel seen or understood or challenged in ways that actually matter, then I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because what we're building here isn't just entertainment or casual content consumption, it's a community of people who are done playing small, done accepting mediocrity, done pretending to be less than they are for the comfort of people who don't matter. Every video I create is designed to give you practical, applicable principles that actually work in real life, not theory or fantasy or wishful thinking, but strategies that have worked across centuries and will keep working because human psychology doesn't change just because technology does. There's so much more to explore about attraction, power dynamics, authentic communication, building relationships that enhance rather than diminish. You and I can't do that effectively if you're not here consistently engaging with the material. So subscribe, activate those notifications, and commit to actually applying what you learn instead of just consuming and forgetting. Your future self, the one who's in an authentic, passionate relationship with someone who chose the real you, will thank you for making that choice today. Now go be uncomfortably, authentically yourself, and watch what happens when you finally stop hiding the very things that make you magnetic.